In the spring of 2010, the Gulf of Mexico was a hub of relentless industrial activity. Oil rigs rose from the ocean like metallic giants, their lights glowing against the night sky. Among them was the Deepwater Horizon, a state-of-the-art semi-submersible drilling rig leased by BP from Transocean. Standing 396 feet long and 256 feet wide, it was designed to tap into oil reserves buried deep beneath the seabed reserves worth billions of dollars. BP, formerly British Petroleum, was one of the largest oil companies in the world. For decades, it had been a symbol of power and wealth, but also controversy. The company had been criticized for environmental damage, workplace safety violations, and aggressive cost-cutting. Still, it projected an image of corporate responsibility, pledging safety as its top priority. But beneath the glossy marketing was an industry where time was money and delays could mean millions lost. The Macondo prospect. The well the Deepwater Horizon was drilling lay about 41 miles off the coast of Louisiana, in waters nearly a mile deep. It was a challenging project from the start. Drilling at such depths meant battling immense water pressure, unstable geological formations, and the ever-present risk of a blowout, an uncontrolled release of oil and gas. By April 2010, the rig was behind schedule and over budget. Every extra day at sea cost BP an estimated $1 million. The pressure to finish the job was mounting, and decisions were being made not just by engineers on site, but by corporate executives hundreds of miles away. On April 20th, the crew was conducting final operations before temporarily sealing the well. They had completed drilling to a depth of more than 18,000 feet, and now the goal was to replace the heavy drilling mud with seawater, a step that would prepare the well for future production. But this swap came with risk. Drilling mud helps contain the high-pressure hydrocarbons trapped below. Without it, any flaw in the well's cement seal could allow oil and gas to surge upward. Halliburton, contracted by BP to cement the well, had warned of potential instability. Tests had shown signs that the cement job might be flawed. Yet BP decided to move forward. In the high-stakes world of deep-water drilling, caution often collided with cost. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the crew began running a critical pressure test, a test that would reveal whether the well was secure. The results were troubling. Pressure readings were inconsistent, suggesting that hydrocarbons might be leaking into the wellbore. Some crew members were uneasy, but others, under immense pressure to meet deadlines, interpreted the results as acceptable. The decision was made to proceed. Hours later, a surge of natural gas shot up the drill pipe undetected until it was too late. It raced to the rig floor, igniting in a massive explosion that tore through steel and sent a fireball into the night sky. The Deepwater Horizon was engulfed in flames. Within minutes, chaos replaced the routine calm. Alarms blared, crew members scrambled for lifeboats, and the Gulf of Mexico lit up like a burning city. In the darkness below, the well was no longer under control, and 11 men would never return home. The first explosion on the Deepwater Horizon was deafening, a sound so violent it seemed to rip through the steel structure itself. In seconds, the lights flickered, alarms screamed, and thick black smoke began to choke the air. The crew, many of whom had been in the galley or their sleeping quarters, were thrown into confusion. For those who survived, the initial blast instinct took over. Men stumbled through the haze, calling out for colleagues. Some were bleeding, others burned. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting the corridors in an eerie red glow. Through it all, the fire was relentless, fueled by the very hydrocarbons they had been working to contain. On the rig floor, the blowout preventer, the massive safety device designed to seal the well in emergencies, had failed. It had been the last line of defense, and now it was useless. Gas and oil continued to gush upward, igniting in massive fireballs that lit the night sky. The control room became a desperate command center. Transocean's crew trained for emergencies, but never for anything on this scale, tried to account for everyone while coordinating with the Coast Guard. But communication was chaotic. The roar of the fire made it almost impossible to hear instructions. Captain Kurt Kuchta ordered the abandonment of the rig. Lifeboats were lowered into the water, some filled beyond capacity. Men jumped into the dark, oil-slicked waves, their survival suits clinging tight against the frigid Gulf water. For those in the sea, the nightmare had only begun. Debris rained down from above, and the heat of the fire was so intense, it felt as if it could sear skin, even at a distance. On deck, others fought to free damaged lifeboats, using every ounce of strength to push them clear. There was no time to think, no time to gather belongings, only seconds to act. The orange glow of the flames illuminated terrified faces, as the rig's towering derrick began to warp and collapse. By the time rescue helicopters and Coast Guard vessels arrived, the Deepwater Horizon was a blazing silhouette against the black water. They pulled survivors from lifeboats and from the sea, some barely conscious, others in shock. It quickly became clear that not everyone had made it off the rig. 11 men were missing, and hopes of finding them alive were slim. For the survivors, the relief of being rescued was tempered by the trauma of what they had seen, and by the knowledge that somewhere beneath the inferno, the Macondo well was still spewing oil and gas into the Gulf. Over the next 36 hours, the Deepwater Horizon continued to burn, a pillar of flame visible for miles. On April 22, 2010, the rig finally sank beneath the surface, leaving behind an oil slick that would soon spread into one of the worst environmental disasters in history. The disaster was no longer just a tragedy for the 126 people on board. It had become a crisis for the entire Gulf Coast and the beginning of a long, damning investigation into BP's role in what went wrong. When the Deepwater Horizon slipped beneath the Gulf's surface on April 22, 2010, the flames disappeared, but the real catastrophe was only beginning. Nearly a mile underwater, the Macondo wellhead had been damaged, and with the blowout preventer, useless oil and gas were now spewing unchecked into the ocean. The scale of the problem was almost unimaginable, a deep-water blowout with no easy way to stop it. In the first hours after the rig sank, BP officials assured the public that the situation was under control. They claimed the well was leaking at most 1,000 barrels of oil a day. But as days turned into weeks, independent scientists, satellite images, and Coast Guard reports painted a far darker picture. The leak was closer to 60,000 barrels a day, more than 2.5 million gallons, making it the largest marine oil spill in US history. The pressure to contain the disaster was enormous. The White House demanded answers. Gulf Coast fishermen watched their livelihoods vanish overnight, and environmental groups warned of irreparable damage to fragile ecosystems. Underwater cameras broadcasting live feeds from the ocean floor showed a constant black plume gushing from the wrecked wellhead, a haunting reminder of how little progress was being made. BP scrambled to deploy a series of containment strategies, each more desperate than the last. The first was the cofferdam dome, a massive steel structure designed to be lowered over the leak to funnel oil to the surface. But when it was placed on the seafloor, icy methane hydrates clogged the dome, making it buoyant and useless. Next came the top kill, an attempt to force heavy drilling mud into the well to suppress the oil flow. Engineers pumped thousands of barrels of mud into the blowout preventer at immense pressure, but the flow of oil never slowed. Then there was the junk shot, in which golf balls, shredded tires, and rope were injected into the well in a bizarre attempt to clog it. That failed too. All the while, the oil kept spreading. Thick slicks coated the Gulf's surface, turning once blue waters into swaths of brown and black. Marshlands in Louisiana became saturated with crude. Pelicans and sea turtles washed ashore, their bodies coated in oil. Entire fishing zones were closed, putting thousands out of work. The smell of petroleum hung heavy in the humid Gulf air. Public outrage was growing. Congressional hearings were convened. Journalists dug into BP's safety record and found a pattern of cost-cutting and regulatory violations. Critics accused BP of downplaying the size of the spill to protect its stock price and limit legal liability. Meanwhile, on the seafloor, remote-operated vehicles worked around the clock in dangerous conditions. They cut away mangled pipe, installed new containment caps, and tried to prepare the well for a relief well, a secondary borehole that would intersect the original well and allow it to be sealed permanently. But drilling in such depths took months, and the oil kept pouring out. By the time the well was finally capped on July 15, 2010, 87 days after the initial explosion, an estimated 4.9 million barrels of oil had escaped into the Gulf. The environmental, economic, and human toll was staggering. And as the investigations intensified, it became clear that the blowout had been preventable. The disaster wasn't just about a failed piece of equipment. It was about corporate culture safety shortcuts and a chain of decisions that put profits ahead of people and the planet. And at the center of it all was BP. In the weeks following the capping of the Macondo, the Gulf Coast began the slow process of recovery, but in Washington, D.C., the storm was just beginning. Congressional committees summoned executives from BP Transocean and Halliburton to testify under oath. The hearings, broadcast live to a furious public, quickly revealed a troubling chain of missteps. BP's CEO at the time, Tony Hayward, faced the cameras with carefully prepared statements. He expressed regret for the loss of life and environmental damage, but insisted that the incident was an unprecedented accident. His now infamous remark, "I'd like my life back," was seen as deeply insensitive, a public relations disaster that overshadowed any attempt at corporate accountability. As investigators dug deeper, the narrative of a freak accident unraveled. The Presidential Commission established to review the disaster found systemic failures at every level. Halliburton's cement job, meant to seal the well, had been poorly executed and inadequately tested. BP had opted for a riskier well design to save time and money. Transocean's blowout preventer, the last safeguard, had not been properly maintained and had a dead battery in one of its control pods. Internal BP documents leaked to the press painted an even bleaker picture. Emails revealed engineers warning about potential problems with the cement and well design weeks before the explosion. One memo described the Macondo project as a nightmare well. Another showed that BP managers had overruled recommendations for additional safety measures because they would add hours and cost tens of thousands of dollars to the job. The Commission's final report concluded that the disaster was the result of a series of identifiable mistakes made by BP, Halliburton, and Transocean that reveal such systematic failures in risk management that they place in doubt the safety culture of the entire industry. The legal consequences were swift and severe. The U.S. Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation targeting BP for possible violations of environmental and safety laws. Civil suits poured in from fishermen, coastal businesses, and states along the Gulf. Environmental groups demanded that BP pay for long-term monitoring and restoration of the damaged ecosystems. Under mounting pressure, BP agreed to set aside $20 billion in a compensation fund for victims of the spill. It was one of the largest corporate payouts in history, but for many along the Gulf Coast, no amount of money could make up for the destruction of livelihoods, the loss of trust, and the permanent scars left on the environment. Still, BP's lawyers fought to limit liability. They argued that Transocean, as the rig's owner, and Halliburton, as the cementing contractor, shared responsibility. The courtroom battles stretched on for years, with each company pointing fingers at the others. Meanwhile, outside the legal arena, the disaster was reshaping the oil industry itself. The US government imposed a temporary moratorium on deepwater drilling, launched new safety regulations, and created the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement to oversee offshore operations. The days of unregulated corporate decision-making in deepwater projects were at least on paper over. But for the families of the 11 men who died on April 20, 2010, the investigations and hearings were a painful reminder that the catastrophe had been avoidable. Every testimony, every leaked memo confirmed their worst fear, that the deaths had not been the result of bad luck, but of calculated risks taken in the name of profit. The story of the Deepwater Horizon was no longer just an environmental disaster. It had become a case study in corporate negligence on a global stage. And BP's brand, once synonymous with energy and innovation, was now stained with images of oil-soaked pelicans and burning seas. Long after the news cameras left the Gulf Coast and the burning rig became a memory, the oil remained. It lingered in the marshlands, on the sandy beaches, and in the stomachs of fish and seabirds. The Deepwater Horizon spill had dumped nearly 5 million barrels of crude into one of the most biologically rich bodies of water in the world, and nature was struggling to recover. Marine biologists documented a grim toll. Entire colonies of pelicans and terns were wiped out in the immediate aftermath. Dolphins, once common in the warm coastal shallows, began dying at alarming rates. Many were found with lung disease, reproductive problems, and chemical burn symptoms linked to prolonged exposure to petroleum and chemical dispersants. Those dispersants, particularly Corexit 9500A, were a double-edged sword. BP had sprayed millions of gallons of them over the slick, both from planes and directly into the wellhead deep underwater. The idea was to break up the oil into microscopic droplets that bacteria could degrade more easily. But in practice, Corexit made the oil less visible while introducing its own toxicity into the ecosystem. Fishermen reported skin rashes and respiratory issues after working near treated waters. Environmentalists accused BP of using dispersants to hide the true scale of the spill from the public and regulators. The seafood industry, a cornerstone of Gulf Coast culture and economy, suffered devastating losses. Oyster reefs, already stressed by hurricanes and coastal erosion, were smothered by oil. Shrimp catches plummeted. Restaurants from Louisiana to Florida saw their supply chains collapse. Even when fishing areas reopened, consumers were wary, worried about contamination. Tourism too was gutted. Summer vacationers who once flocked to sugar-white beaches stayed away, deterred by images of tar balls and hazy, oil-slicked horizons. Hotels and charter boat operators closed. In small coastal towns, unemployment soared. For residents, the environmental disaster was also a public health crisis. In addition to respiratory problems, some reported headaches, nausea, and neurological symptoms after exposure to crude oil and dispersants. Doctors along the Gulf began documenting clusters of unusual illnesses they suspected were tied to the spill. Many feared that the true health impacts would only emerge years later. BP's public response was a carefully crafted blend of contrition and damage control. The company pledged billions for environmental restoration projects, rebuilding marshes, replenishing oyster beds, and protecting endangered species. Glossy ad campaigns featured images of pristine beaches and smiling fishermen declaring, "We will make this right." But behind the scenes, there was tension. Local activists argued that BP's restoration programs often favored high-visibility projects over the less glamorous long-term work needed to repair deep-sea ecosystems. Scientists warned that some species might never recover fully. Studies found that oil from the Macondo well had settled on the seafloor, creating dead zones where marine life had been wiped out entirely. Years after the disaster, tar balls still washed ashore after storms. Certain fish species showed deformities and lesions. And while BP sought to move on, rebranding itself as a leader in renewable energy, the people of the Gulf knew the truth. The oil was still there, woven into the very fabric of their home. The Deepwater Horizon spill had not just changed the environment. It had changed the relationship between the Gulf Coast and the industry that had sustained it for generations. Trust was broken. And in the court of public opinion, BP's green and yellow logo would forever be stained black. By 2011, the courtroom battles over the Deepwater Horizon disaster had escalated into one of the largest and most complex legal cases in US history. BP faced a tsunami of lawsuits from federal and state governments, private businesses, individual fishermen, and environmental organizations. The company's survival as a global oil giant was no longer just a matter of engineering and public relations, but of legal strategy. The US Department of Justice came out swinging, accusing BP of gross negligence and willful misconduct. Those two words, gross negligence, carried enormous weight. If proven, they could quadruple the fines under the Clean Water Act, pushing BP's liability into tens of billions of dollars. BP's lawyers countered that the disaster was a tragic accident shared among multiple parties, including Transocean and Halliburton. In 2012, BP struck a massive settlement with tens of thousands of individuals and businesses along the Gulf Coast, agreeing to pay roughly $7.8 billion. This was separate from the $20 billion compensation fund it had already set aside in the early days after the spill. Yet even as BP paid out claims, it challenged thousands of them in court, arguing that fraud and exaggerated losses had inflated the payouts. Criminal charges followed. BP agreed to plead guilty to 14 counts, including felony manslaughter for the deaths of the 11 workers and lying to Congress about the rate of oil spilling into the Gulf. The company agreed to pay $4 billion in criminal penalties, the largest such fine in US history at the time. The legal drama stretched on for years. In 2015, after a lengthy civil trial, a federal judge ruled that BP had indeed been grossly negligent. The decision triggered maximum Clean Water Act penalties. BP eventually reached a record-breaking $18.7 billion settlement with the federal government and 5 Gulf states, the largest environmental settlement in US history. For BP, the numbers were staggering. By the end of the decade, the total cost of the disaster, including fine settlements, cleanup expenses, and restoration projects, had climbed past $65 billion. No corporation had ever paid more for a single environmental disaster. Yet the legal costs were only part of the damage. BP's market value plummeted in the years after the spill. Investors fled. The company suspended its dividend for the first time in decades. Credit rating agencies downgraded its debt. In the court of public opinion, BP's brand was toxic. The green and yellow sunburst logo, once meant to symbolize clean energy, became a symbol of environmental destruction. Late-night comedians mocked it mercilessly. Protesters staged oil spill demonstrations outside BP gas stations. Social media campaigns called for boycotts. Inside, BP executives wrestled with how to salvage the company's global reputation. Some pushed for a total rebranding, even a name change to distance the company from the disaster. Others argued that only time and consistent safety improvements could repair the damage. BP began pouring money into renewable energy projects and marketing campaigns, touting its environmental commitments. But skepticism ran deep. The disaster had also changed the oil industry's relationship with regulators. The US government implemented stricter offshore drilling rules, requiring more robust blowout preventers, real-time monitoring, and independent safety certifications. For oil executives, the Deepwater Horizon was now the cautionary tale that loomed over every boardroom discussion about cutting costs or rushing a project. But for the families of the dead, and for the communities still struggling to recover, BP's legal reckoning was about more than fines and settlements. It was about the acknowledgement, however begrudging, that corporate decisions had cost lives, destroyed livelihoods, and inflicted lasting wounds on an entire region. Even years after the last courtroom battle had been settled, the Deepwater Horizon disaster continued to cast a long dark shadow over the Gulf of Mexico. For many along the coast, life was divided into 2 eras, before the spill and after the spill. The disaster wasn't just a chapter in history. It was a living wound reopened every time tar balls washed up after a storm, or a fisherman hauled in a catch that looked sick. In the bayous of Louisiana, oyster harvesters still spoke about the black summer when the reefs died. Some had never gone back to work their boats permanently dry docked. Shrimpers who stayed in business faced smaller hauls and higher costs, and many had to diversify into crabbing or guiding fishing charters just to survive. Tourism slowly recovered, but not entirely. For years, the mental image of oil-slicked beaches haunted travelers. Even as hotel bookings rose, some businesses never reopened their owners, unable to survive the lean seasons immediately after the spill. The ecological effects were just as enduring. Studies published 5 and even 10 years later found oil from the Macondo well embedded deep in the Gulf's seafloor sediment. These oil mats were buried beneath layers of sand, but could be churned back to the surface by hurricanes, creating fresh contamination events. Certain fish species showed genetic mutations linked to hydrocarbon exposure. Dolphin populations in some areas had not recovered, with calves dying at unusually high rates. The disaster also altered the psychology of the oil industry. Inside boardrooms, the phrase Deepwater Horizon became shorthand for the worst-case scenario, a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe that could cripple even the largest company. Offshore drilling projects now faced greater scrutiny from investors, insurers, and governments. Blowout preventers were redesigned, safety drills intensified, and emergency response plans expanded. Yet in the eyes of many environmentalists, these changes were too little too late. They argued that the industry's fundamental incentives to extract more faster and cheaper remained unchanged. Some activists pointed to BP's gradual return to deepwater projects as proof that the lessons of 2010 were already fading. For BP, the road to image rehabilitation was long and uneven. The company invested in renewable energy initiatives, from wind farms to solar projects, and pledged to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Its advertising campaigns showed smiling workers restoring marshlands and rehabilitating wildlife, carefully curated to signal transformation. But for many Gulf residents, those ads felt hollow, a glossy cover over a story written in crude oil. In schools across the region, the spill became part of the local curriculum. Children who had been too young to remember April 20th, 2010, learned about it through science lessons on ecosystems and history classes on environmental law. Teachers framed it as both a tragedy and a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when technology greed and human fallibility collide. And then there were the families of the 11 men who never came home. For them, the legal settlements and corporate apologies meant little. They kept the memories alive through annual memorials gathering at docks and churches, to read the names aloud, throw wreaths into the water, and remind the world that the disaster began with a human loss. The Deepwater Horizon was no longer a single event. It was a legacy of environmental fragility, of corporate accountability, and of the human cost of energy. And as the oil industry pushed ever deeper into the ocean, the question remained: would the world truly remember the lessons paid for in blood and crude? In the end, the story of the Deepwater Horizon disaster was never just about oil. It was about the cost of ambition, the fragility of the environment, and the human lives that too often become collateral damage in the pursuit of profit. On April 20th, 2010, an explosion ripped through the Gulf of Mexico, but the shockwaves carried far beyond the water's surface, reaching into corporate boardrooms, legislative chambers, and the homes of ordinary people. The disaster forced the world to confront a truth it had long tried to ignore. Our hunger for energy comes with risks that are not easily measured in dollars. 11 men gave their lives on that rig, and their families will carry the weight of that loss forever. Millions of barrels of oil poisoned an ecosystem that had thrived for millennia, its intricate balance undone in a matter of days. The cleanup, no matter how massive, could never truly erase the stain. BP's legacy is now split in two. On one side, the company is a global energy powerhouse funding renewables and speaking the language of sustainability. On the other, it is a symbol of corporate overreach, remembered for a preventable disaster that cost $65 billion and left an indelible mark on the planet. The green and yellow sunburst will forever be shadowed by images of oil-slicked pelicans burning seas and grieving families. For the Gulf Coast, the scars are both visible and invisible. Marshlands slowly regrow. Oyster beds are painstakingly reseeded, and tourism rebounds. But beneath the surface, in the deep sediment, in the altered DNA of marine species, the disaster still lingers. The trust between coastal communities and the oil industry has been fractured, perhaps beyond repair. On the global stage, Deepwater Horizon became a textbook case for policymakers, environmentalists, and engineers. Governments passed stricter safety regulations. Drilling technology improved. Companies invested in better blowout preventers, more rigorous inspections, and advanced spill response plans. Yet critics warn that all of this means little without a fundamental change in corporate culture, one that puts safety above speed, people above profit. The lessons are clear, but they come at an unbearable price. The disaster stands as a warning. When safety is compromised, when caution is ignored, and when accountability is absent, the consequences can be catastrophic. And those consequences will not vanish when the cameras leave or when the stock market recovers. They will remain embedded in the environment and in human memory. As the sun sets over the Gulf today, its waters glitter in the light, hiding the darkness that still lies beneath. The horizon looks calm, but the people who live here know better. They know that this beauty is fragile and that vigilance is the only safeguard against another tragedy. The story of the Deepwater Horizon ends here for now, but the questions it raises remain unanswered. How much risk are we willing to accept for energy? How many warnings will we ignore before the next disaster? And when it comes, because history has shown it will we be ready? Or will we once again pay the price in oil and blood?